back on the Zero Hour. Here's a quick email item that I think our next guest will appreciate as well. Since I mentioned the day the Earth stood still in my opening monologue, I got an email from my son, Nick, that says his girlfriend and he were watching The Day the Earth Stood Still, the original from the 50s. There's a scene where a newspaper spins its way onto the screen, as they used to do back in those old movies. Underneath the headline, "Step Up Hunt for Spaceman," is a headline that says, "Bill aids owners on foreclosure." And the subheadline to that says something along the lines of, "Measure bars proceeding without court permission." Nick adds, there's also a picture with a caption that reads, "The Spaceman and His Robot Bodyguard," which, as Nick says, is still ironically more believable than a story about real protection from foreclosure. Now, our next guest was one of the first people to call out the asset bubble, the housing bubble that led to the disastrous events of late in the first decade of the 21st century. And he's with us now, economist Dean Baker, who is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. Dean, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot for having me on, Richard.
And listen, before we get started, you wrote a piece in, this is not our main topic, but you wrote a piece, I think in 2002, the run-up in home prices, is it real or another bubble? So how did you keep from going insane in 2009 when everybody kept saying no one could have seen this coming?
They're still saying that. You get used to living in Washington. I mean, the level of dishonesty in this town is just kind of unbelievable. We're seeing this again. Sorry to change the subject a little bit, but we're seeing this again in the case of Iraq, where all the people are running around, Dick Cheney first and foremost, talking about how, we have to go into Iraq because of the weapons of mass destruction, and they're all going to welcome us as liberators. They're now pounding their fists saying, oh, President Obama has to go in there and start bombing this and that, and you guys got everything wrong. Well, it's the same thing in economics that, all these people completely missed the housing bubble, and I'm not going to take credit for being, hugely prescient or anything. To my mind, it was obvious. You had to look at the data. I'm not saying that, the typical person on the street when they came home from their job, should have said, oh, there's a housing bubble. I mean, people like me who do this for a living, it was really inexcusable. We had a huge run-up in house prices, no precedent for it. And the idea that would either stick, which was kind of incredible. We had record vacancy rates. There were all sorts of reasons this was clearly not being driven by fundamentals. That it would stick was absurd. And the idea that there wouldn't be a problem. I just read former Secretary Geithner's his autobiography, and he's going, well, no one thought anything like this. Just go, how could you not, Geithner? What do you do? There were almost half the people who bought homes in 2005 put zero down or less. People actually often borrowed more than the value of their house. I'm not kidding you. This was from the National Association of Realtors. It's not my own secret data set. And you just go, okay, you have people that have nothing down. What's going to happen on those mortgages when the price of those houses fall 20, 30, 40%, as it did in many cases? And you just go, it's bad enough that Geithner was surprised. He was chair of the New York Fed at the time, so he was in the middle of this. But what's incredible is here it's 2014, and he's still going, who could have known? You just go, what are you doing, Tim Geithner? You were Treasury Secretary. You were surprised that people who had put nothing down just saw their house price fall 30, 40% in value. You're surprised that those mortgages went bad?
Part of what amazes me here, Dean, is that and I'm not, saying I'm morally superior or whatever, but if I get one figure wrong in something I write, I'm depressed for days, and yet here people who were in positions of enormous responsibility were spectacularly wrong, and I don't get any sense of, gosh, I'm sorry, a sincere sense, or maybe I ought to go back to school, or maybe I ought to rethink my basic assumptions. To me, it's what you're describing is kind of a fascinating anthropology problem. And I'm wondering to what extent the same culture is still, I think it is, but you tell me your thoughts, is still driving the economic decision-making we're seeing today.
Oh, totally. I don't want to push sales to Timothy Geithner's book, but I think it is truly remarkable in that sense because he's clearly writing. I'm not going to try and get into his innermost thoughts. I have no idea. but he clearly is writing. The takeaway from the book is, look, something really bad happened. We did the best we could, and we just don't understand why all these people out there are upset. And, the incredible part of the story, you just look at the basic facts. All the people who got us into this, with almost no exceptions, I didn't say almost because maybe someone can point to one I don't know about, almost no exceptions, the people at the banks who are stuffing their pockets, securitizing fraudulent loans, they're fine. The policy people, Alan Greenspan, Timothy Geithner, they're fine. He just made millions of dollars on his book. He's great. On the other hand, we have tens of millions of people who lost their homes, they're out of work, they're underemployed. They didn't do anything wrong. And Timothy Geithner is saying, I don't understand what you people are so upset about. Those are the facts.
See,
no one could dispute those facts. But, he thinks people like you and I are being weird because, we're not happy.
Well, and the tone seems to be, I read the book too, I reviewed it, the tone seems to be, hey, cut us some slack here. As if it's a personal thing rather than a debate about what we're going to do now, which is really, and I guess what strikes me about this, and since we're on it, let's be on it, and let's talk about it. What strikes me about it, I felt there was a moment maybe 2009, maybe when the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission was starting up, a couple other things. Alan Greenspan was saying, gee, maybe I was wrong about some of my basic assumptions. Bill Clinton was saying, maybe I went about this the wrong way. I felt that this was the moment when if we had some leadership, our assumptions might have changed, but I felt that a signal came maybe from Obama, but somewhere as if an ultrasonic whistle had been blown. No, we're okay. Nobody's going to challenge us. We're not going to be held accountable for our mistakes, for our wrong assumptions, for the revolving door between Washington and Wall Street. None of it. So everybody immediately, as if on cue, seemed to go back to business as usual. Did you get that sense, or was that just me?
Well, I don't know if we're ever that close. I mean, the problem is that the critics are, of course, a diverse group. We don't all agree on everything. That's not surprising. And there's no sort of easy way to organize power among the critics. On the other hand, the incumbents, if you like, the bankers, the top policy people, no one has to organize them. They are organized. So it's very, very difficult to pose a challenge. And they have incredible, it's not just their control of money, but, their access to the media. I'm a little reluctant to use the word control because it's not as though they call up people, although they do sometimes do that. I think call up reporters and say, why don't you write X, Y, and Z? But they get their views in the media. It's very hard. I could sometimes get something in the New York Times, and my friends can too. But that's really the exception. They're there every single day, and I don't mean they have an op-ed. They might. But more importantly, the news story is, here's what Timothy Geithner, Treasury Secretary, said, or here's, a release from the Treasury Department. So that's out there every day. It's very, very hard to organize any sort of challenge. I don't want people to become frustrated, and give up, but I'm just saying, realistically, we were never able really to challenge them.
So what now? I mean, I want to get into a couple specific things you've written, but just in general, since we're talking about this, and by the way, in my review, I compared Geithner's books to the pillow book of a 10th century Japanese court lady, that it had anthropological and sociological interests, but as an economic guidepost, I didn't think it had much to offer. It mostly was a glimpse of how a certain group of people think and interact and all that. But in terms of the economy, in terms of decision-making, what do people do? How do people stay informed? How do they, obviously they should read you and the stuff you write, and a few other folks too, but what do people do to fight discouragement? Just take encouragement from the existence of people like Elizabeth Warren and Sanders in politics and try to support that kind of action, or Occupy, or what are we talking about?
Well, there's a variety of things. Certainly seeing people like Warren, she's obviously very popular, she getting her into the Senate, and no one wants to, you read Geithner about Warren. It's clear he doesn't think much of her, but he's very circumspect in how he talks of her, because he doesn't want, there's nothing in there that you could point to and go, oh, see, you said Warren's an idiot, because he might think that. I have no idea what he thinks of Warren, but I suspect not very good. But he certainly didn't say anything in there that, people who admire Warren, as I do, we could point to and go, oh, look at what you just said about Elizabeth Warren, that was a big thing. But, realistically, what can you do? Well, I try and say, where we could do things in Washington, do in Washington. Where you can't, you look other places. And there are things that can be done at the state level, even the local level. I mean, I see our enemies, first and foremost is the financial sector. One of the things I've been a big fan of is the financial transactions tax. Now, I do a big tax. You would have to do that at the national level. You couldn't do it at a local level. Now, one exception, Chicago and New York probably could, a small tax. But one thing that you could do is at least state governments, some local governments might be able to do it, tax transactions of mortgages. So when mortgages are packaged into mortgage-backed securities and sometimes they're sold several times, you could tax those. Those could be taxed at the state level, which to my view would just be a great thing. It's the sort of thing that, where that makes sense and someone wants to sell a mortgage, go ahead and sell it. But, we pay sales taxes and we buy clothes, often food, all these other things. What's wrong with having a modest tax on selling a mortgage? So I just mentioned that as the sort of thing that you could do that will hit the financial industry and, begin to bring this into fuller view.
I think that's a great idea. Actually, I hadn't heard that. I hadn't thought about that or heard that. But and you could structure it, I suppose, so that a house sold in California, for example, would have to be taxed in California, so you don't have state-to-state manipulation like we see in other areas of the financial sector. But I guess the other thing that I know sometimes people think I'm a little crude in the way I put things, but I also think, and before we go to break, I'm curious your thoughts. But I also think there's something to be said for saying, for example, that, when Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, which had paid $20 billion in fines, I think in 1 year, speaks to the graduating class of Syracuse University, where Chase gives a lot of money, to say, please let's keep people like that away from our young people because, they're a bad influence. People think that's a little crude, maybe it is, but I think there's something to be said, isn't there, for pointing out that what a lot of these people do is either, if you're Jamie Dimon, is either morally questionable at best, or you're not a very good leader because you can't seem to stop this epidemic of fraud in your own institution.
Yeah, I would certainly, object to him being, a commencement speaker, at school. I had anything to do with, this became a big issue. I don't know if I hadn't realized if he was speaking in Syracuse. I don't know if it in particular in reference to him, but there'd become a big issue over people protesting commencement speakers. And commencement speaker, that's an honored position. So it's not. You're not bringing someone there to express their views. If you're going to have Jamie Dimon come to campus to say, here's what we do at J.P. Morgan, great. That's what universities are for. But when you have them as a commencement speaker, you're saying this is an important individual we should really learn from. And I would have a really hard time saying that about Jamie Dimon.
Well, and the fact is he did speak at Syracuse, partially because they've endowed an enormous amount of money to the business school and teamed up with the business school to essentially make it, among other things, a training system and feeder system for banking, for Wall Street, which I would argue is leading our youth astray. But when we come back, there are a couple other things I'd love to talk about with you. One is your piece on the sharing economy, which is a topic close to my heart, and the other is this week's report on the GDP. So, Dean Baker, if you can stick with us and talk about these things after the break, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure thing. Happy to.
Great. Well, thank you for that, and we will be back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. With us is economist Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. His blog, Beat the Press, is something you should read because the press always frequently seems to get economics very, very wrong. And Dean, I would be remiss not to ask you about this week's report revising GDP growth estimates for the first quarter and saying that we didn't grow. Things slipped backwards. One of the big shifts in that report was that health spending did not go up, according to the report, by nearly 10%, as initially reported, but contracted. Consumer spending seems to be down. What is going on? Why are our signals changing so much, and what are those signals telling us?
Well, a few things. I mean, a lot of people jumped on the numbers. 2.6% the economy shrank at a 2.9% annual rate, which is a lot. Now, you look at it, it's driven mostly by some erratic factors, inventory movements, which are always erratic, subtracted 1.7 percentage points from GDP, and there was a big fall in exports, also erratic numbers. So I'm not so worried about the negative. The bigger question is, what does this say about the underlying growth rate? A lot of economists, myself included, thought that we might see a growth for the year for 2014 on the order of 3%, perhaps even a little better. That's very hard to see right now. So we're not going to see the economy shrinking. People are talking about recession. That's not true. But we are likely looking at an economy that's growing less rapidly than was generally believed. So for calendar year 2014, maybe we're looking at 2%, if we're lucky, a little bit better. That means we're making up little, if any, of the lost ground. The economy's potential, its underlying rate of growth, is in the neighborhood of 2 to 2.5%, which means, 2%, 2.1, 2.2 if we're lucky. We're not making up any of the ground we lost in a downturn. So that's not good news. The healthcare, that actually was very interesting because we've had a slowdown in healthcare cost growth for the last 5 years, and a lot of debate about what it's due to. Clearly, recession was part of the story, but that can't explain the continued slow growth. The Obama administration wants to take credit with the Affordable Care Act, no doubt contributed to it. Undoubtedly, there are other factors, but what was striking was we first had the exchanges come online, of course, in January, so it wouldn't have been surprising to see a big uptick. What we see now is that we actually show a decline in spending for the first quarter. My guess is that didn't really happen. We had a big jump in spending reported for the fourth quarter, so odds are we just, we overestimated. Our data is never perfect. We overestimate growth in the fourth quarter. We underestimate the number in the first quarter. Basic story, we're still on a very slow growth path. Now, that's very good news for the economy over a long term, because if healthcare costs had continued to rise at the rate they've been rising, in the 80s, the 90s, and the first part of the last decade, that would devastate the economy. So that looks like good news for healthcare. We still need new demand in the economy, and we're not seeing very much, and that is certainly cause for concern.
Yeah, I guess a couple of the questions that came to mind for me, one was, if there's one area I feel reasonably confident in, which is a dangerous statement for me to make, it's healthcare financing, because I worked in that field for a lot of years, and I guess we've talked about the Affordable Care Act before, but I guess that one of the I could never give much credence to the idea, A, that we could see nearly 10% growth in this quarter, and B, that it would be because of the Affordable Care Act, with enrollment still continuing throughout the first quarter. So I always wondered to what extent people were reading something into the numbers that wasn't there, and I wondered why there wasn't more pushback or challenging. This number seems like an outlier. Clearly, I don't understand the process of estimating GDP internally all that well. I've never been exposed to that, but I would have thought that would have raised serious questions. If it grew by an annualized nearly 10% in the first quarter before enrollment was done, what was going to happen in quarter two and quarter three? So, and I guess one of the things that struck me about it was that at the time the first numbers were reported, people said, Obamacare saves the economy. Yeah, I saw multiple variations of that headline. Things would have been looking bad, but fortunately healthcare spending is up. Now I'm seeing headlines that say Obamacare saves spending by controlling healthcare costs. It seems to me we don't know what's going on yet with healthcare spending. There are multiple factors at play, and we haven't figured them out yet. Is that fair?
Well, the slower growth we've seen for a long period of time. So the direct impact of Obamacare, I'd be hesitant to make a commitment on one way or the other. So, that I agree with you completely. This slowdown's been, we've been seeing this really since '08. So I feel reasonably comfortable saying we're on a slower track. Now, whether, the Affordable Care Act, means that it's now going to accelerate so we don't stay on the slow track, or it might make it even slower. I have ideas on it, but I don't feel we have any basis for really answering that at this point. But, the fact that we're on a slower growth path, I think that's pretty clear at this point, because healthcare costs have grown way more slowly, for the last 6 years than they did, say, in the prior quarter century, or probably even longer.
But that's also been a recessionary, most of that anyway, at least for large segments of the economy. There's also been a drag on the economy. So I guess, yes, I understand that. I guess my question is how much of that, if the economy were to pick up, for example, where would that go? Number one. And number two, I guess, and you and I have talked about this before, my concern, I think we agree it's premature to credit or blame the Affordable Care Act for much of this. But my concern is that I want us as a society to continue, even if healthcare costs were to flatten, I would want us to continue to worry about them for a fair amount of time to come because they're still intolerably high for large numbers of people. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, absolutely, in two senses. One, just looking at us compared to the rest of the world, we pay twice as much per person as the average for, England, France, Germany, Canada, whoever you want to throw into that mix. And we don't have anything to show for it in terms of outcomes. So we can't, there's certain areas, you get the conservatives here and they go, oh, we have better results in this area. You go, okay, fine. We have 50 ways to evaluate our health care, and we could find 3, 4, or 5 where we do well. For the most part, we don't do particularly well, and this has been looked at by a lot of people. So you have these stories about the long lines. Well, those are fabrications. I mean, I have to wait when I want to see a specialist. Most people do. That's true in other countries also, and sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. So we're paying twice as much, and that's a really big deal. We should be asking why. If we paid twice as much for our cars or anything else, we'd be saying, well, why is that? What's going on? How come we can't get our costs down to what they have in other countries? And the other thing, as you say, is just a very practical matter. It's still a very big drain on a lot of people's budgets. So, even people getting health care through the Affordable Care Act, through the exchanges, a lot of people are still going to see very big bills. So it's a serious issue. It hasn't gone away as being a big cost that is a huge burden on a lot of people. So absolutely, we definitely should be talking about it.
And I like your analogy of what if we paid twice as much for cars? I think that's perfect. And what if we paid twice as much for cars that were in the shop all the time and got terrible mileage, which is kind of, to complete the analogy with healthcare. So I guess we'll have to just keep tracking this over time. We won't have a chance this time around to talk about the sharing economy, but to suffice it to say, I really enjoyed your piece on that, and we are certainly of like mind when it comes to Uber, Lyft, Amazon, and these other entities that are created by the government, in large part by policy indulgence, and then claim to be the sort of shock troops of a libertarian revolution in our economy. But that we'll have to save for another conversation. Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C., as always, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on.